Hello students, this is Professor McDermott. Well, the topic for this lecture is the Hellenistic world. The Greeks called their country Greece Hellas. So the Hellenistic world is simply the Greek world, the world of Greek culture as it spread throughout the Mediterranean world as the Greeks grew in power and influence. But actually, instrumental in spreading Greek culture throughout the world were a neighboring country called the Macedonians and their leader, Alexander the Great. So we'll also talk about Alexander during this lecture. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about some schools of thought that started in ancient Greece, which still have an influence on the life of the mind today. Socrates, the very famous Greek philosopher Socrates, had a student, his prize student named Plato, and after the death of Socrates, Plato started a school which became known as the Academy, and it was actually named after a forest in the suburbs of Athens, where Plato would take his students. This was called the Grove of Academe, and they would just walk around and talk about ideas. So it wasn't like what we think of as a school with a building and desks and so forth. But the school of Plato's came to be known as the Academy. And what did Plato teach his students? Well, Plato believed that the entire universe, what the Greeks called the cosmos, was a perfectly ordered system. And in order to understand the order of the cosmos, it was very important to use your reason and your mind. In other words, the goal of philosophy was to, in a sense, purify your thoughts from any taint that came to them from our senses, which Plato did not believe were trustworthy. One of his most famous stories from his book called The Republic is called The Allegory of the Cave, and the whole point of the story is that our senses cannot be trusted to give us any kind of truthful knowledge. So we should always be skeptical of what our senses are telling us. We'll talk about skepticism in just a minute. We should always doubt the evidence of our senses, and instead we should try to use our pure mind and our pure reason to understand the truth about the universe. So in philosophy, to this day, this way of thinking that Plato started is called idealism. Now, Plato's most famous student at the Academy was a young man named Aristotle, and when Aristotle matured, he went out on his own and started his own school called the Lyceum, which lasted from 335 BC to 322 BC, also in Athens. Some things that Aristotle is famous for, well, one is his concept of God. Aristotle really did not believe in the Greek gods. Instead, he had a more refined conception of God, and his name for God, he called him the prime mover, because Aristotle noticed that everything in the universe is in motion, and so he reasoned that there had to be some kind of divine being at the origin of everything who put everything in motion. And so Aristotle called God the prime mover, the first mover. And later, this argument would be taken up by the Christian saint Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century as one of his 5 proofs for the existence of God. Also, Aristotle's philosophy is very noteworthy in that he really went in an almost completely opposite direction in some ways from his great teacher, Plato. Aristotle actually trusted the evidence of the senses. He pointed out that, in fact, everything we know comes to us originally through the senses, and therefore we had no choice but to use our senses to find knowledge about the world. we have to use them intelligently, of course, but Aristotle believed that we must, in fact, use our senses to find out about the world. And so Aristotle was one of the first great natural scientists, really, we could say, in human history, because he spent a lot of time observing the world around him and classifying plants and animals, things that he observed in the world using his senses. And any school of philosophy that relies on sense knowledge is called empiricism. So in a way, Aristotle became the founder of empiricism. So both of these ways of thinking, idealism and empiricism, are still very prominent in the world of philosophy today. And I want to mention actually a few other schools of thought, because Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were not the only important thinkers in the ancient Greek world. And these too have repercussions down to the present day. In fact, some of these terms, as you'll see, we use in everyday conversation. One important way of thinking was called skepticism. In a way, this was very much in keeping with Plato's ideas, but the skeptics took Plato's thinking even farther. Not only, they said, could we not get any true knowledge from the senses, not only should we doubt our senses, but they really didn't think that human beings could ever discover the truth about the world at all. And so they were skeptical. And even to this day, a lot of times, so people will still use this term. If you tell somebody something or express some opinion of yours, they might shake their heads and say, "Well, I'm skeptical about that." In other words, meaning that, I doubt it, because the skeptics doubted everything. Another even more extreme way of thinking became known as cynicism. The founder of the Cynics was a man named Diogenes, who lived in Athens. And Diogenes lived through the Peloponnesian War, especially the terrible last phases of the Peloponnesian War, when everybody in Athens was suffering terribly. And Diogenes became very bitter and very disillusioned about life and about society, and especially Athenian society, the way it was going. And so essentially he decided to drop out of society, and he left his home and he went to live on the streets of Athens in a large ceramic pot, as you could see in the painting there. And he would sit in his pot on the street of Athens, and he would, day by day, he would shout very angry, nasty, bitter things at the people who passed by about the way life was in Athens. So even today, when we meet someone who's very negative about life or very bitter about things, or who feels like the system is rigged against them or whatever, we might call that person a cynic. Yet another important school of thought in the later period of Greek greatness, or actually more in the period of Greek decline after the Peloponnesian War, is known as Epicureanism, after its founder Epicurus. Now, Epicurus had a much more positive vision of life than Diogenes. He believed it was possible to achieve happiness in this lifetime, and that the way to do that was simply to enjoy the good things of life, such as food and good wine and music and art and friendship and conversation and sex and, all of the pleasures of life, but in moderation. In other words, he really didn't want people to go overboard in terms of seeking pleasure, because he realized that was not healthy for anybody. But he felt that if people would simply enjoy the pleasurable things that we have in life and enjoy them in moderation, that you could find a significant level of happiness. That's Epicureanism. But a rival philosopher named Zeno proposed a system of thought that was nearly the opposite of Epicureanism, and Zeno's teaching became known as Stoicism. Zeno believed that the way to be happy in life was not through indulging yourself in pleasure, but rather sacrificing yourself, giving up pleasures for the sake of doing good to others. So Zeno really emphasized our duty to others. He considered self-sacrifice a virtue, that is a good quality that we should live out. We should sacrifice our own pleasures for the sake of our duty to other people. And Stoicism became very popular in the Roman world, especially after the Romans conquered Greece. And then later it was picked up by important thinkers within the Christian church, because obviously it fit very closely to the whole idea of Christianity and the sacrifice of Christ, and the idea of living a very moral, very virtuous life for the sake of others. And so Christian thinkers took this Stoic idea, and out of it they developed the idea of natural law, which is the idea that God has put a law in the universe that all of us have to follow. Does that sound familiar? Well, it's actually quite similar to the Taoist idea of the Tao as the law of the universe. Christians, in a way, call their version of the Tao the natural law, and it's very closely related to this idea of stoic self-sacrifice for the sake of others. All right, well, I said that actually the Macedonians, just to the north of Greece, were very instrumental in spreading these ideas and other aspects of Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean world. And that's kind of ironic, actually, because from the Greek point of view, Macedonia was considered a very backward, kind of primitive country. In fact, the Greeks would call the Macedonians barbarians, because actually they considered everybody who did not speak Greek a barbarian. And so the Greeks kind of looked down on the Macedonians. However, in the 4th century BC, Macedonia had a king named Philip II, who lived from 382 to 336 BC, who loved Greek culture. And in fact, he spent a large part of his young adulthood in Greece, just kind of soaking in Greek culture, really fell in love with the country. And he even became famous because he entered his horse in the Olympic horse racing competition and won. So he was an Olympic champion. And when this happened, one of his wives took the name Olympias to celebrate his victory. I say one of his wives because Philip actually had 7 wives, but Olympias was the favorite wife of Philip II. If you've ever seen the movie called Alexander, that was directed by Oliver Stone, starring Colin Farrell as Alexander, it's a good film. I highly recommend it. But the actress who played Olympias is Angelina Jolie, and I think she did a very nice job portraying Olympias. Well, anyway, Olympias is the wife who gave birth to Alexander, the future Alexander the Great, in the year 356 BC. And by this time, Philip had returned to Macedon, but he was determined that his son Alexander would be filled with Greek culture and would grow up essentially as a little Greek boy. And so to make sure that Alexander had the best possible tutor in Greek culture, Philip got none other than Aristotle to leave Athens for a while and come up to Macedon and serve as Alexander's tutor, which he did. And so both Philip and Alexander promoted the Greek language and Greek culture in Macedon and beyond. And in fact, in 338 BC, Philip II of Macedon saw his opportunity to take over Greece. The Greek city-states had weakened each other greatly with their constant warfare. I mean, first you had the Peloponnesian War, which was really a catastrophe, especially for Athens, and then you had subsequent wars, and really the Greek city-states were worn out with fighting each other. And so in 338 BC, Philip was able to take advantage of that situation. He took an army into Greece and succeeded in conquering most of Greece in the Battle of Chaeronea. And so now Macedon essentially took over Greece. But in 336 BC, Philip II got himself assassinated, and that meant that young Alexander became king in his father's place at age 20, King Alexander III of Macedonia. Now, Alexander really did fulfill his father's wish, and he really loved Greek culture as well. And as soon as Philip died, Alexander announced that he intended to punish the Persian Empire for having dared to invade Greece during the Second Persian War. And so he intended to restart that war essentially and take it into Persia. And so Alexander raised an army of 42,000 troops and got them across the Hellespont, which was the little channel leading into the Black Sea, and marched them into Asia. Philip II, by the way, had really made Macedon a military superpower. He had adopted the Greek method of fighting using the phalanx. The way this worked was that the soldiers each would have a long spear and a very large shield. And they would get into kind of a square formation, and they would march together with their shields up to protect themselves and with their spears sticking out so that they could overrun the enemy and kill them with their spears. It looked almost like a giant porcupine rolling over the enemy, the Greek phalanx. But Philip had even improved on this tactic, because the Greek spear was typically only about 8 feet long, but Philip had increased the size of it to between 13 and 21 feet. And so the Macedonian phalanx had an advantage over other soldiers who were using that shorter spear. Philip, also in terms of military technology, developed an invention which was used for centuries as part of what we call siege warfare. A siege is when one army will surround a walled city or a fort and lay siege to it. In other words, try to starve out the soldiers inside to prevent any food from getting into the fort or the walled city, so that eventually the people have to surrender. But Philip realized that you could make a siege go even faster if you could just knock down the walls of the city or the fort. And so he created an invention called the catapult, which was like a very long wooden lever that had a basket on the end in which you could put a large boulder. And so if you pulled that lever back with ropes and then let it go, the boulder would be sent flying towards the walls, and you could batter down the walls that way. It was almost like a primitive cannon. And it was very effective in terms of siege warfare for many, many years. Well, anyway, back to Alexander's march through Asia. His first major encounter with the Persians came at the Battle of Issus in Asia Minor in 333 BC, and this was Alexander's first victory over the Persian Emperor Darius III. But after defeating Darius at Issus, Alexander decided to take a detour into Egypt, which was still a very wealthy country, and so a very attractive target for conquest. But before he got to Egypt, he stopped at a little place in Asia Minor called Gordium. And in Gordium, there was a temple, and inside the temple there was an old war chariot that had a very complicated knot attached to it. I mean, it was a rope that was knotted in a very complicated way. And so when Alexander got to the temple, the priests came out to meet him, and they explained to him that there was a prophecy that anybody who could undo that knot would become the ruler of all of Asia. So Alexander thought about it, and he looked at the knot for a minute, and then he ripped out his sword and just sliced the knot in half, cutting the Gordian knot. And that was Alexander all around. Very direct, very no nonsense. A man who really knew how to get what he wanted. And he did become the master of Asia, at least as much of Asia as was known to Europeans at that time. Well, anyway, when Alexander got to Egypt, the Egyptians were actually delighted that he was there, because for many years they had been dominated first by the Assyrians and then by Persia, and those were traditional enemies of Egypt, and so they really hated that situation. And so they saw Alexander as a liberator who was going to liberate or free them from the Persian domination. And so they actually welcomed Alexander with open arms. They even crowned him as pharaoh. You see there that little relief sculpture of Alexander as pharaoh of Egypt. While Alexander was in Egypt, he visited the oracle, the priest prophet of the sun god Amun-Ra, and the oracle informed Alexander that he was in fact a son of Amun-Ra, and that meant that he was actually a god. And Alexander seems to have really believed this very flattering message and taken it to heart, as we'll see from some of his behavior later on. One of Alexander's great contributions to Egypt, he decided to create a great city to, kind of celebrate his conquest of Egypt, and modestly he named it after himself. He called it Alexandria. And Alexandria in Egypt would become one of the great cities of the ancient world, and it had many marvels. It had a magnificent museum. It had a wonderful library, the largest library in the Mediterranean world, with about half a million scrolls, really, of wisdom texts and great literature. It also had a wonderful lighthouse. As I'm sure you know, a lighthouse is a tall building that sits next to the sea, and it has, well, in those days it would have had a flame at the very top, and the point of the lighthouse was to guide sailors into port when it was stormy or when it was nighttime. And the lighthouse of Alexandria was considered, it was so elaborate, it was so technologically advanced that it was considered to be one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. All right, well, if you take a look at the map here, you see the Battle of Issus in 333, you see the little detour into Egypt. But having enjoyed his stay in Egypt immensely, Alexander then returned to his business of conquering Persia, and marched his army towards the heart of the Persian Empire, but was met in battle in 331 BC again by the Persians at a place called Gaugamela. And this time Alexander won a really decisive victory, smashed the power of the Persian military. And so from this point forward, we can say that Alexander had essentially won his war with Persia, and all that was left for him to do was to claim his crown as ruler of the Persian Empire. So he made his way south to Babylon, as you can see, and then eastward to the capital of the Persian Empire, Persepolis, where he was crowned king of Persia. And then he went on kind of a goodwill tour of his new kingdom. He headed north into Media and then eastward into Parthia and Bactria, where he decided to marry one of the local princesses whose name was Roxanne. Um, and you notice on the map that everywhere he went, he founded cities, which he always named Alexandria. Although they usually would have a second name, which would kind of set them apart from all the other Alexandrias. One city, though, in the very eastern part of the empire that he built, he named Bucephala after his favorite horse, Bucephalus. So, in any case, Alexander eventually reached the Indus River in western India and Pakistan, and this was really the edge of the known world at that time for Europeans. And there's a very famous story about Alexander that his generals one day spotted him sitting on the banks of the Indus River, just crying his eyes out, and they approached him and they said, "Oh, great king, what is the matter? What's wrong? Why are you crying?" And Alexander said, "Because I have no more worlds to conquer." In other words, he had conquered all the known world, and essentially he had already accomplished everything he set out to do, and he was still a very young man, so essentially his whole life had lost his purpose. There were no more worlds to conquer. But in fact, even if Alexander had decided to go on farther, he really couldn't at this point because the soldiers had gotten fed up. They were so far away from their home in Macedon and really very nervous about going any farther. And so essentially they put down their weapons and refused to go a step further. And so Alexander had no choice to head back to his new capital, Persepolis, and to rule his empire from there. Now, historians have often asked the question, Alexander was taught by none other than Aristotle, and he certainly was, very effective in his career. And so some historians have portrayed him as a sort of great genius, almost a philosopher king, someone who was very wise and really had a great plan for his empire. Others have suggested that Alexander was simply hungry for power and that he sort of made it up as he went along. He really didn't have a plan. He was just improvising. I'm not sure I have a really strong opinion on that either way, but I will point out that there was one aspect of Alexander's administration where he did clearly have a plan to try to bring the different parts of his empire closer together. Alexander at one point ordered his generals, about 80 of his top military leaders from Macedon, to get married to Persian women. And in this regard, Alexander really set the example by marrying the local princess Roxanne. And in fact, he built a city which still exists today. It's actually now the city of Kandahar in Afghanistan, which many Americans have had occasion to visit in recent years. He meant for all of those generals to go with their Persian wives to Kandahar and to live there and to show the world that all of the different peoples within his realm could coexist together in harmony. Because he understood that actually, if you want to bring people together from different nationalities and different ethnic groups, probably the very best way to do that is to get them to marry each other. Because then they have, a strong interest in each other's welfare, and then they have kids, and they have a strong interest in, what's best for their kids, and they work together, and it's just a great way to break down cultural barriers. But in this matter, he got a lot of pushback from those Macedonian generals who, were actually very prejudiced against people they considered to be foreigners who had very strange ways and customs. And they were also very worried because they really saw Alexander changing before their eyes and adopting new habits and new customs which alarmed them, such as the Persian gesture, which was called proskynesis. Essentially, Alexander required that anybody who came into his presence get down on all fours and touch their forehead to the ground. Now, this act of proskynesis, prostrating yourself before someone, was something that you would only do if you believed that person was a god. And so this is a sign that perhaps Alexander really did believe those words of the oracle of Amun-Ra, that he really was God. And of course, for the Macedonian generals who had known Alexander since he was a little kid, that was just ridiculous. They knew they knew Alexander was just a man like they were, and certainly they knew that he had his own faults and failings. So they really rebelled against this attempt by Alexander to take on all the trappings of the Egyptian monarchy or the Persian monarchy, and demanding to be treated like a god. The last days of Alexander are quite sad, and in a way, it kind of brings out the truth of that story about Alexander crying next to the Indus River, because he really had accomplished everything he set out to do, and it's almost as if he didn't have any purpose at this point, and he really took to drinking more and more. And in fact, Alexander died rather suddenly in June of 323 BC after a particularly prolonged drunken bout. And this was really a disaster in a way for the empire, because Alexander was still only 33 years old, and he didn't expect to die that young, and he hadn't even really designated a successor, anyone to succeed him as the ruler of the empire. Now, it just so happened that Roxanne, his wife, was pregnant when Alexander died, and so after his death, she gave birth to a boy who became Alexander the Fourth. But of course, he was just an infant. Both Roxanne and the boy's grandmother Olympias tried to serve as his counselors and his protectors within the empire, but more and more power went to three of the great generals, whose names were, you don't have to remember these names necessarily for any exam, but their names were Seleucus, Antigonus, and Ptolemy. And so as time went on, these three generals began to compete for power within the empire. And what wound up happening is that Olympias died, and both Roxanne and the boy king Alexander IV were killed. And so after the death of Alexander's son, essentially the empire was split into three pieces. And one of the generals took Macedon, and one of the generals took Asia. But General Ptolemy took over Egypt, and it was his family, the Ptolemies, that would rule Egypt right down to the death of the last of the Ptolemy family, Queen Cleopatra the Seventh, whom we will meet later in this course.